Welcome to the Elaborate Topics podcast, where we focus on lab-specific strategies for medical laboratory professionals. We're proud to be the healthcare detectives that work behind the scenes to get the results needed to influence medical decisions. Let's grow together and jump right into the lab.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Elaborate Topics podcast. I'm your host for today's show, Stephanie Whitehead. For those of you tuning in for the first time, I'm your podcasting laboratory leader and co-host for the Elaborate Topics podcast. Our show is a weekly podcast where myself and my co-hosts, Taiwana Wilson and Lona Small, bring you topics related to the laboratory and leadership to help you excel inside and outside of the laboratory. So do us a favor and subscribe to our show and share this show with all of your laboratory colleagues. I'm really excited for what we're going to talk about today because it's such a relevant topic in our community right now. And I've got a very special guest with me to assist me with the conversation today. So I'm going to welcome to the show Dr. Alae Kawam. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I am super excited to be on this podcast today. We're going to be talking about things that I am just so passionate about, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to, be able to discuss it with you.
Well, we're excited to have you. So before we get too far into our conversation, you've done so much work in the laboratory medicine space. So why don't you just take a minute and introduce yourself to our listeners and let them know a little bit about your laboratory journey and where you are and what you're doing today.
Thanks. So my name is Alae Kawam. I am a board-certified pathologist in anatomic and clinical pathology. I am currently a surgical pathology fellow, and I'll be pursuing a cytopathology fellowship afterwards. I graduated residency this year in 2022, and I am interested in laboratory leadership. I'm interested in wellness, and I'm interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am originally from New Jersey. I went to college in New Jersey. I graduated college back in 2014. I graduated medical school in 2018. I actually went to a DO school, which is a Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine medical school. And then I went to residency in New York for 1 year at one hospital, transferred over to another hospital, and then graduated from there. And my current surgical pathology fellowship is at the same place I did my residency.
Cool. So tell me, what's your favorite part about being a surgical fellow?
My favorite part about being a surgical fellow, I'd have to say, is the agency and independence that I got and being able to look at everything. Mm-hmm. I could not pick one subspecialty. So I just was like, well, what do I do if I like everything? Mm-hmm. Well, you pick everything, which is surgical pathology. When it comes to agency and independence and confidence, I'd say those are like my favorite parts of being a Surg Path fellow. I did residency, I'm doing the fellowship at the same place I did my residency, and people know me and I know them. And it's really great that they trust me diagnostically. They trust me. They have confidence in my abilities. So for me to kind of grow up and be respected more in the field and be more involved in patient care, I think is the best part.
Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited today because we're going to be talking about a subject that you are super passionate about, which is basically wellness and burnout. And it's something that we don't talk about enough, I think, honestly, not just in laboratory medicine, but in healthcare as a whole. I mean, I think the past 2.5 years have been very challenging, to say the least, for our profession and, again, in healthcare. And I'm really glad that many different forums are bringing this to the forefront. And so I'm excited to hear your thoughts and your perspective on, the increased stress for laboratorians right now, not just due to the pandemic, but just due to all of the things that are happening in our society and are preventing us from bringing our entire self to work. There's so much attention and there's so much to be said about this. I saw an interesting post, Dr. Kawam, on LinkedIn recently, and I'm going to read it to you. It's a survey from the Association of Ontario And it said that 90% of MLTs are experiencing burnout. 73% actively desire to leave the laboratory medicine profession. 46% are contemplating early retirement, and 27% are wanting to leave but are not seeking that as an option, but they want to. So I'm going to ask you, what is burnout and what is the difference between burnout and like just normal fatigue? Just me naturally feeling like I'm just tired, I need a vacation, versus resident or laboratory, tech burnout.
Yeah. And I think just being able to define what burnout is going to give our listeners some insight and understanding of what we mean when we say that word, because it is used widely. And well, what is it, right?
Yeah.
So when a person is under chronic stress and they experience a cynicism and a skepticism and a depersonalization in addition to fatigue, and they're feeling like they're not going anywhere and they're not progressing and their job is not fulfilling, that is the essence of burnout. It's not just being tired. It's being tired and unfulfilled and cynical and skeptical. You feel detached. You feel like you're not growing. Basically, you're stuck. And I think that when a person experiences that, they're not aware that they're experiencing those feelings. And it's constant frustration. It's associated with being more irritable at work, bad coping mechanisms. So that's kind of like the definition. It's that fatigue plus that cynicism, skepticism, depersonalization. And it can be a result of anything, honestly. It could be a result of chronic stress, being overworked. Maybe that's one factor that could be relevant to the laboratory workers, particularly during the pandemic. A toxic atmosphere, a lack of growth, too much demand. It's just anything that could be chronically stressful. We associate burnout with work, but that doesn't mean that other personal things can't be contributing to it. So if a person is under constant social pressure, then yes, absolutely, that can also lead to burnout in that realm. Mm-hmm. And when you, not you personally, but like when the universal you, when you don't experience pleasure or fulfillment from something that you're doing, it becomes more of a burden, and it becomes this more of this vicious cycle of like adding on to that stress.
It's like a task.
Yeah, exactly. And it is important to include healthcare at large, but when in particular for laboratory professionals, they really, really suffered during the pandemic. All those COVID tests had to go somewhere. And I think that the public doesn't recognize that all those COVID tests had to go somewhere. And there were supply chain issues and there were staffing issues because people were getting sick too, because laboratory professionals are human too. They get sick. And what happens, if a certain number of people are out, they're sick, now all that work is dumped on fewer people. And so the people who are actually, running those tests, and it's too much. And in addition to just, the constant running around where you're constantly getting fed with, for example, the COVID tests and the stress at home and the anxiety of the pandemic, that adds a lot. That's a lot for one person to take in. Mm-hmm. And it really just sits with you. And it's hard because it's like, well, where's your release? How do you relax from that when it's constant? So yes, people did get burnt out, and it was a recipe for disaster. That being said, I think from the leadership perspective, this is the time to learn to make this fail-safe. And I've definitely had discussions with leadership at my institution about stuff like this, where it's like when something happens in a society, and I give this example. So like when cars were invented, cars were not inherently dangerous. But there were things that did happen. Accidents, airbags got invented, seatbelts got invented. Why? Because it was a safety issue. That was the safety issue of that time when that thing was invented, the car, right? We had to make it safer and better. Well, how do we make today's world safer and better mentally? And I think this is the challenge of today, is how do we make this safer and better for people? And I think that the big institutions need to recognize that they're the winners in the end as well. because you get to retain a workforce, which brings in another issue. We have a serious retention issue in laboratory medicine. It's a serious issue, and I think it's not being addressed enough. And I think part of it, and I actually have talked to one of the laboratory leaders about this, and there is interest in potentially making work more flexible, depending on different people have different needs. For example, people with children in school want to have more of a fixed work schedule because they want to be, at home when their kids come home. Other people want a little bit more flexibility. And I think one solution that was proposed was to train people in different stations so that they can cover different services so that they can enable that flexibility.
Mm-hmm. This seems like it could be such a cycle, though. You know what I mean? Like, you are not providing an environment that promotes wellness. So then burnout can accelerate, and then people will leave, and then you try to recruit, and then the environment, it just seems like such a cycle. So I'm wondering, I'm a leader in the laboratory space, but I also work in a laboratory where there are fellows and residents. And so what are some of the signs and symptoms? You kind of mentioned that at the beginning, but what, if I'm just coming to work and I'm in my own head too, right? I have my own things going on. What would I be looking for in a colleague, coworker, or an employee that would cue to me that perhaps, maybe there's something deeper going on. Maybe they are showing signs of burnout.
So yeah, I think one very important thing, particularly for the residents and fellows, is to recognize burnout versus another serious mental health issue. And I'd like to distinguish those because residents and fellows are under a lot of pressure. There is a lot of research out there that talks about mental health in residents. I don't like to, it is important to mention that there is a higher suicide rate within the medical field. Physicians tend to have one of the highest suicide rates, unfortunately. It has become an issue. It is something that does get publicity. I wish it would get more publicity and more action. But that's one thing that I think is important to mention, the distinction between burnout, which is bad, but another mental health issue. Mm-hmm. And there is overlap. For example, somebody who comes into work usually happy, excited, curious, who comes in, doesn't care, and just wants to get the job done and leave. A change in attitude, a change in behavior, people who call out sick more often, people who aren't doing work that they normally would, in the sense like they're not performing up to what they normally would perform. That's an issue. What else? There's also changes in attitude, changes in behavior. If anyone has bad coping mechanisms, for example, if they are consuming more alcohol or showing up to work in a less than better state, that could be a warning sign. But then again, that could be a warning sign of either or. So there's some overlap between the two. Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad you brought it up for the resident and fellow population, because it is such a serious issue. And I would go as far as saying, well, the residents and fellows in a lot of institutions, not every institution, but in a lot of places feel like they do quote unquote scut work, where they're just doing work just to get work done, and they're underpaid and they're not happy. And when you're kind of in that situation, yeah, that's a recipe for disaster. You're going to feel really, used and abused by the end of it, and you get jaded, and you're not happy about the work anymore. And there are a good number of doctors who leave medicine. I know the laboratory has issues with retaining laboratory workers, but so does healthcare at large. Nurses, doctors, people are leaving because they're not happy. And in the business world, they do focus a lot on retention. I don't think they focus enough of it in the healthcare world about how do we retain people. Mm-hmm. And I think that one thing that people don't recognize, especially in leadership, is when you work in healthcare, you're doing the job of seeing the patient, but you're not just doing that. You are doing way more than that. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you're an internist, and you see the patient for 15 minutes, which is never enough, and then you have to go home or finish your work later in the day, write the note, that's another 20, 30 minutes. So you just spent maybe 40 minutes or so, 40, 45 minutes of dealing with that patient, but those 20 minutes of note taking is not paid work. that's work that's unpaid. Um, yeah, because it's not part of the visit, quote unquote, even though it's documentation purpose, which is like probably
Yeah.
just as important as seeing the patient. If you've never wrote it down, it never happened.
Hmm.
So that's unpaid work, and people don't realize that that is overwork. Like it is extra work, but nobody sees it that way, and that's a problem. And there's a generational difference. I once went to my primary care doctor, and he was like, "Oh, well, I do it for the one up above," and I was like, "But you also have rights as a person who works, and you
Yeah.
deserve to get compensated fairly.
Hmm.
They need you just as much as you need them."
Right.
I mean, that's one topic. The other thing is important to recognize is that um, we do in the medical field, maybe not so much in the lab, we do a lot of emotional work, and physicians are constantly exposed to a lot of emotionally traumatic things throughout the day. Seeing someone pass away, having to give a cancer diagnosis, these aren't easy things to do. They sit with you, and it really takes away from your cognitive ability, like in the sense of you have a finite amount of brain function in the day.
Hmm.
And if you're using it on emotional thing, it does take away from other parts, like your decision making capacity. That's why by the end of the day you're exhausted. You worked yourself.
Yeah. And you've worked more than you probably realize. I mean, your unconscious mind has worked just as much as your physical body has worked, it sounds like. It's really interesting because it sounds like this intersects with a previous conversation I had with another very special guest, Christine Talamonte, in season one. And she had done research on what is called the second victim. And the second victim really talks about, or really is a theory of just those peripheral or ancillary healthcare workers that also experience emotional trauma from traumatic things happening in healthcare. For example, I may not be the doctor taking care of a patient, but I'm the blood bank technologist that is, issuing blood for a massive transfusion. And I feel that just as much as, that physician, or I'm the tech that's continuously running, daily labs on a NICU baby, and all of a sudden it stops because, and you don't really know what happened. It's very much like a 911 operator where you're involved and then all of a sudden not involved, and you have to move on to the next case, the next thing. But part of you, that human part of you, wants to really just process what happened. And it almost sounds
Yeah.
like that. And so,
Yeah.
everybody's different, right? Everybody's pain tolerance for physical pain is different, but everybody's emotional pain tolerance is different. Because even for me, when you were talking, I would say that I probably can say I've experienced, maybe, and I don't know what the scale is, but different levels of burnout. But I think also I consider myself just a really motivated person. I've been able to kind of like get my engine back going and find other things that have brought me passion until I was able to get back on track. And so for people who maybe aren't able to do that on their own, if not identified, if not addressed, um, I wonder what is the overall impact to our profession and ultimately our patients. I mean, we talked about the retention issue a little bit, but it sounds like it could have a larger impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've definitely read of scenarios where somebody was fatigued and came to work and made serious medical mistakes. I mean, it's very loaded.
Hmm.
I do want to circle back to kind of like just for our listeners to get a better sense of what the symptoms of burnout are.
Yeah.
So there's like, before I go into the next topic, which is, the idea that medical mistakes, and there's a very particular one that I am going to mention.
Okay.
So for our listeners, if you feel like you could be experiencing burnout, that could feel like a sense of failure, self-doubt, feeling like you're drowning, feeling like you're helpless, trapped, defeated. There is a component of detachment as well as feeling very alone. You mentioned motivation loss. That's another symptom as well. having a very cynical and negative outlook, like I mentioned, like that skepticism component. So for our listeners, if you're experiencing anything like that, that could signal that you are experiencing the burnout. So to kind of get back to the other topic, which was medical mistakes. So there was a very unfortunate occurrence. I think it was back in the 80s, maybe early 90s, when the ACGME, which is the American Medical Graduate Medical Education Council, American Council of Graduate Medical Education. Basically, this is the governing body of all the residencies in the United States. Mm-hmm. Got involved in a case of a young girl who had a history. She was taking psychiatric drugs because she needed it. It was prescribed to her by her physician, and she came into the emergency room to seek emergent medical attention. She was given a medication that interacted with her other medications that basically, killed her. It was a medical error. And there were a lot of issues that came up with that because the doctors that made that medical decision to give her the drugs to treat her were, I think, on 36-hour shift. Like they had been working over a day. It was either a 24 or 36-hour shift, basically making medical decisions. And there was a lack of supervision. I mean, that was another issue. But just being overworked like that and having to take care of someone who eventually passed away, that's a huge error. And unfortunately, what had happened, I mean, she passed away. The part of the recipe that it got attention was that I think one of her parents was involved in journalism. So they made a very big deal out of it. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, somebody had to pass away and it had to get some type of media attention for it to change. And that's kind of the equation for things to change. And then the policy comes later because the ACGME did get involved. And new policies were established for work hour restrictions, supervision. It's a very complicated thing. I'm really giving like just the bare bones of the situation, but it is important for people to recognize that unfortunately terrible things have to happen for things to change. And I don't want things to get there. And I kind of want to be the advocate to say, hey, leadership, wake up. You have a serious issue. It's already going in a bad direction. Wake up, start changing the way you're doing things. The volumes that you have are not volumes you had 10, 15 years ago. You need a new strategy. You need to wake up. You need to be able to function with the new generation as well, because our, Gen Z, and I'm a millennial, but Gen Z has totally different outlook on things. Yeah. And you need to be able to recruit people from that generation. And in order to do that, you need to understand what their values are. And very interestingly enough, I was reading an article the other day about Gen Z and how they're not interested in hustle culture anymore. And what is hustle culture? Hustle culture is like, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to do everything I can in my power to reach the top. Gen Z is more like, this is a means to an end. I just need to make my money and I want to go home and do whatever I want. Because if I wanted to, I can become a TikTok star and make lots of money. That's the outlook. But the idea is like, well, how do you reel these kinds of people in? I have discussed with leadership where they're interested in, they like to go to high schools and teach people about the opportunities in the lab, and they haven't had much luck with recruiting people. It's like, well, why not? And I told them, I was like, well, do you guys have a social media presence? This is how you communicate. This is the new way of communicating. If you don't have a social media presence and you're trying to recruit people, well, you're not looking in the right places. You're not communicating on the right platforms. It's so leadership has a certain vision, and it's great because of the technology they can bring in and things that they can accomplish, but it's not addressing certain issues that are going to come up, like the recruitment issue, retention issues. I've even gone as far as suggesting the 4-day work week to our leadership, and not just for the I suggested it for the pathologists more than the laboratory technicians, but it was something that could be done, and it was kind of on their radar, but it is very hard to accomplish. And then that brings in the higher ups to kind of be involved in that financial decision-making process, because unfortunately that's what's going to determine whether that goes in that direction, is the financial component to it, is can we afford this? or do we want to invest in this? Is the return on investment worth it? And I'm going to tell you from now, dear leadership, if you're listening, leadership, the return on investment is worth it, because good managers invest in people and they invest in results. And if you invest in people, you will get results.
I love that. And I love that you said that you have been doing so much work as an advocate for this space and this topic. So I kind of want to dive into that more because I know that, we discussed I don't know if you pioneered or if you work on a wellness committee in your institution. So tell me more about your advocacy work and that wellness committee. And in your definition, what does it mean to be a well-rounded employee? How do we move from the problem to the solution in your mind?
Yeah, so wellness, in a very simple terms, is you cannot have wellness if you're not eating, sleeping, and exercising and socializing as you need fit, as your body needs, or as you socially need, or as you spiritually need, or as you emotionally need. If your basic fundamental needs are not met, then you will not be well, period. If you're sleeping 4 hours a night, you're not going to be able to function. I mean, there's a very small percentage of the population who can function on 4 hours of sleep. They are extremely rare.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, those fundamental things cannot be compromised. And as far as when it comes to wellness, I think that one key thing, besides what I just mentioned, like the basics, there's other aspects. So those are the personal things. And then there's institutional things. And institutions like to remind people hey, there's this yoga class, there's this wellness resource. That's all great, but it means nothing if you're fundamentally not getting your own needs. And there's another piece that a lot of people miss, which is giving people personal agency. What does that mean? Giving people the time, the energy, the resources, the money that they need to be able to make themselves well. For example, So one lesser mentioned thing that's personal to me is my spiritual wellness. So I am Muslim, I wear a headscarf, I pray 5 times a day. Part of my wellness is to be able to pray during the workday. So for me, having a space is extremely important for me to practice my faith, because that's something that makes me feel at peace. That when I go to pray, it kind of regrounds me. So I'm able to get back into the game and get back to work. So that's part of my wellness, but that's me. And giving me the personal agency to do that is important to me. And other people have different kinds of agency, or they have different examples of different agency. This is my example. Somebody else could have something else. So for example, if people want to be called by certain pronouns, that could be part of their wellness. The spiritual thing was mine, but, the pronoun thing could be for someone else. Or if it's more flexible work could be part of their wellness. It's different things for different people. And I think the key is to give individuals agency to pursue that.
But, okay, so now we make a more interesting point that brings our entire topic into an even more full circle, which is the DE&I component, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion component, which is also, I think, a very important topic in laboratory medicine and healthcare today, making sure that we are diverse in our spaces and in our profession, making sure that we are inclusive, not only in gender or in the way people decide to have relationships, but also in age. Sometimes more tenured pathologists like to, what do we say in healthcare? We eat our young, So, you may have the pathologist that is, been around, 30, 40 years and is extremely intimidating to a resident or a fellow. And so making sure that we are inclusive in our learning environment, our teaching environment, so we can all be successful. And so it sounds like there's an intersection in this conversation between DE&I and what it takes to be well and prevent burnout. Is that correct?
Yes, there definitely is. And there's some overlap too, because I think that people, in order for them to feel well, they need to be accepted for who they are. and respected. And I like to think of three things. It's about respect, understanding, and compassion. And respect, understanding, and compassion for what? It's for who they are. It's for what they believe. It's for how they practice. It's for what they eat. It's for how they spend their time. It's that respect, understanding, and compassion. And when those three things I think are present, people will feel more welcome and everybody wins, not just individuals, but the institutions as well. I really like to emphasize the human component, but when it comes to big business, which is how things are run, the human component is kind of seen as a means to an end. It's like, we need to make people happy so they don't quit. And I'm going to say, well, we need to make people happy because they're people, and people should be treated with dignity and respect. And that to me is more important because, like I said, good leaders take care of people and results. And if you take care of your people, you will inevitably get good results. And when it comes to fostering that atmosphere, I think that's when the institutions, the big businesses need to get involved, which is establishing an appropriate culture, a culture of inclusivity. And like I said, that can mean different things for different people. And it can be local. It doesn't have to be inclusive of everything. It needs to be inclusive to what's relevant. So, for example, if you have like a big Muslim population, for example, then it would make sense to have a prayer space, for example. Or if you have a certain number of people from a different type of background, ethnicity, maybe making a holiday that's not a U.S. holiday, kind of like a holiday for them, may be relevant. So it doesn't have to be the same everywhere, but it should fit and make sense. And I think that's the key, because it is individual, not just for the person, but individual for the culture of that institution, So it needs to make sense, and it needs to be relevant.
And if one of our listeners today is hearing this and is saying, you know what, I don't work in a diverse or inclusive environment. My environment is not either accepting or just maybe doesn't acknowledge, what I need to feel well. What would you suggest they do if they had concerns about their experiences in their own personal laboratory? I know you've talked about, coaching leaders and big businesses on the ways to improve the environment and the culture towards some of these initiatives. But if you're speaking to an individual who may be feeling like, yeah, I'm experiencing these things and it's a problem for me, what would you suggest that they do?
I think the first thing is to know yourself and know what your values are, and 2, speak up. Mm-hmm. I have to say that when I've spoken up, it's done me well. So I would encourage people to find the confidence, find out what they're looking for. Truly, what are you looking for? If you don't feel well or whatever, what is it? Speak up and ensure that you have a strategy or a solution or a potential idea that you can work with leadership to work on to get to the thing that you want. What's your vision? What do you have in mind? Because leadership wants to get things to move forward. They're not interested in stagnating. That's why they're leadership, right? That's why they lead us into the future and they progress, because they're interested in hearing new things. And I would find that most of the time, if you're scared that they're going to reject you, there is a possibility that they'll reject you, but you got it on their radar. And sometimes they'll actually listen, and sometimes they'll take what you're saying very seriously. And it is scary, because it's like, who am I? I'm just this, person who's working here, going up to leadership. I mean, I've definitely had moments where I was like hesitant, but I was like, sometimes it's more beneficial to say something than to deal with the consequences of things not being said. So find the confidence, know what your values are, and speak up.
Mm-hmm. You definitely have to be an advocate for yourself.
Absolutely.
And I would say, Dr. Kawam, it comes across when you speak. You can definitely tell that there is a passion for this topic with you. And I wonder, where does that come from? What motivates you so much in this space?
I experienced the burnout in medical school. I experienced the lack of diversity, the microaggressions in medical school. I lived it. and I was angry.
Mm-hmm.
I was angry for a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
but I decided to channel that anger into something useful. And what that useful thing was to talk about it, educate myself. So I had to do my homework and I had to do my reading, and I had to turn it into something useful, which is to communicate it with people, to get it out there, to get it on their radars. And eventually you get involved in committees, and committees do things. They make policies, and policies change the way things are run and how things are dealt with. And I think that's the ultimate goal, is to get things not just in the culture, but in the way how things are dealt with systematically or systemically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, systemically, so that they are, so we deal with it systematically in the system, systemically.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in medical school, I experienced the burnout. It was hard because I experienced people who made comments about my faith. I experienced people who made comments about me wearing a headscarf in the operating room, even though I was following the dress code, because I had a headscarf on that was under my cap, the operating room cap. It's like, well, you shouldn't be wearing outside clothes in here. Well, it's like, well, how can you accommodate me? How about that?
Yeah.
What can I do? I'm not going to give up my headdress for this, because there are other parts of the world that do provide disposable headdress. It exists. Right. So I experienced the microaggressions. I experienced the burnout, not just from the microaggressions, because it did affect my learning, because I couldn't connect with people, or I guess I couldn't connect with people because of the things that they said. It was very hard, or the attitudes that they had. It was very hard to benefit from them. That's one thing. The other thing was that the burnout also, I didn't feel included, but part of it wasn't the atmosphere for me. The clinician atmosphere, like just being the prototypical internist or pediatrician or gynecologist or surgeon or whatever, I just didn't fit in. And I had to learn that about myself too. I fit in with the pathologist. I was so happy. I would go to the pathology lab, be like, I'm going to the pathology. I was super excited. Like, I'd go down with a smile, and it was like a change in atmosphere, or like, it just felt like I got this like serotonin surge in my brain when I'd go down to pathology. I felt very welcome, not just by the people, but by the material there too. I found the material very interesting, and that's kind of what led me into pathology. Was first and foremost when I was introduced to pathology as an academic subject, when we still had our didactic sessions in the first 2 years of medical school, was I found myself reading Robbins, which is the prototypical pathology book. Like, I actually read it and I got lost in it. And I was amazed with understanding disease process, rather than rote memorization, which is what 80% of medical school is. So disease process to me was much more fascinating and attractive, and it pulled me to go into pathology. And then when I went on my rotations, I realized that I really liked the people, and I also liked the workflow, and I liked the emphasis on efficiency, quality assurance, and quality control. Like, that's a personal value of mine. Like, do things and do things right, and make sure that you're doing things right. Mm-hmm. So that just resonated with me on a very personal level as well. And when I was not living those values, those were things that were predisposing me to burnout, not feeling welcome, not feeling like things were efficient, which a lot of clinical medicine is. It's not very efficient, and there's no way that it can be, because that's not how patients work. Mm-hmm. So to kind of put an efficiency value on something that's inherently inefficient is unrealistic. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I lived it. And by the end of medical school, after I got my match results and I was happy that I had matched and all this great stuff, I did a lot of reading, and I educated myself on what burnout is, on microaggressions, feeling inclusive environments, what my rights are in the workplace. I just did a tremendous amount of reading. So I sat down with myself, I sat down with my feelings, and I sat down with some books, and I did some reflection.
I feel like that is amazing. That is amazing. And I feel like, well, I'm not going to say seem to, I know you will have such a bright future and career in laboratory medicine. There's so much ahead of you and so much more that you can do, and I'm sure you will do in this space for yourself and for others. And one of the other things that I love that you said, because we say it so much on this show, is that when you don't like something, It does not help you to sit and sulk in your feelings and complain and live in regret and complain. You have to be part of the solution. Join a national organization, join the ASCP, join ASCLS, join AABB, be a part of an organization, a committee, a council that will help you solve problems.
Misery loves company. Misery loves company. And sometimes we get to a point, I tell my family this sometimes. I was like, don't let your feelings get in the way of your success. Deal with
Yes.
your feelings, deal with your feelings, sit with them the one day, 1 week, 6 weeks, whatever it is, sit with them.
Yes.
Let them take their course. Do what you need to do to figure it out. Don't write any emails. Don't write when you're in that state. Sit with it. Figure it out. And then once you've cleared your mind of your feelings, then you can think straight and kind of redirect yourself onto what needs to get done. Have a vision. And I'll be honest with you, I am sincerely interested in pursuing laboratory leadership. I know it's something that takes time, and I do find it difficult to get in that realm because I do find that I don't get taken as seriously as much as I want to, because I feel that there is a separation. I don't think, I don't want to play the victim role and say, hey, I'm in a headscarf, nobody's taking me seriously. But I think that there is a component that when you share values with people, they are more likely to quote unquote let you in.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely feel like I've run into that challenge in certain areas where I feel like I want to make a change and I have the energy and I have the ideas and I definitely want to be involved. And it's like, well, how do I get involved? And I am part of like a couple of these pathology committee, not committees, the organizations. And I just want to get more involved because I want to change things and I want to represent people at the bottom more. And I want to change the way things work and I want to make things more fair and I want to make things better and I want to make things work more efficiently. Not just for the way that the laboratory flows, but for the way the people work too. It needs to make sense. So I have a vision that things will make people, that hopefully the future holds under good leadership, things that are more feasible, more sustainable, more efficient for the people who work in the lab in the future and healthcare at large, honestly. One of the things that I've been trying to convince leadership for some time now is the 4-day work week. I think it's time that people adapt or more flexible work. I think that's the step in the right direction because it definitely solves a lot of it will create issues and it's not easy, but it is something that I think needs to happen because we need to address this burnout issue. And the only way we can address it is if people feel like they have more time to achieve things. If they're not getting their fulfillment from work, they need to get it elsewhere. And if they need to get it elsewhere, they need the time to do it. The time, the space, the resources, the energy, the money, whatever it is, because you need to sustain a workforce.
Yeah, I think you would make an awesome leader, and I wouldn't sell yourself short because I think even when you look back historically, one of the greatest traits of every great leader who's ever led any type of movement is just the passion and concern and care for people and seeing everybody as humans and the humans that they are, not the humans we want them to be. And you clearly have that, and it clearly is conveyed when it comes across when you speak. So I wonder, as you go through your career, far down the line, I'm sure, many, many, many years from now, when you are reaching the end of your very victorious laboratory or healthcare career, and you look back, what do you want your legacy to be? So if somebody were to write a book about you, or if you were to write a book about yourself, what would that title be, and what would that back of the book summary say?
I really appreciate your comments about leadership. I really hope that, one day I can lead a laboratory and I have a vision to bring things to the future, really go for progress, not just in a business perspective, but in a human perspective too. And I think there is a way to balance both. As far as the title of my book, I think I would probably say
Drum roll.
Excellence in Progress.
I love it. I love it.
I want to make sure that things aren't perfect, but they're excellent. They're great. And they embody things like good values. They embody things like taking care of the people who have a lesser voice. And just bringing a lot of, like I said, compassion, understanding, and respect in so many different forms, not just for the people, but even for the businesses. Like it's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that compassion, understanding, and respect. Bringing that, I think, just propels people forward on a very deep level. And it's something that we overlook because it's not really measurable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we always talk about SMART goals.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be a specific goal, a measurable goal, attainable, blah, blah, blah. Well, what about things that you can't measure? Those are important too. And they're actually things that people on a personal level use to measure. I like that person. I don't like that person. It's completely subjective. I like that person more, right? It's not really quantitative. It's more qualitative, but it is important.
Yeah.
It's not really measurable, and I think that measurable things are great, but it's not everything. There's way more to the story that we don't account for.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so much into this conversation, and I mean, we could talk for hours about this, but as we wrap up our conversation, I mean, there are so many gems that you talked about in the beginning of the conversation, to understanding what burnout is, understanding, you know, when you are feeling different, knowing what is wellness and what is wellness to you. I wonder if you could wrap all of that up and leave our guests with some tidbit or some piece of advice that would help them along the way, maybe 2 to 3 things that you think would help them be successful on this topic. What would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, take care of yourself. Get your sleep, you know, get your exercise, eat properly. Self-care is fundamental to any type of success. And it is extremely important that that is your basal function. Like this is something that you cannot compromise. Number 2, be radically honest with yourself. What do you actually want, and what is it that you think you should be doing? Be radically honest with yourself. 3rd, have a vision. Know what you want. Know how you need to get there. And if you don't know how to get there, do your research. Know what you want. Have a vision. Don't be afraid to network within your profession and outside of your profession. Don't be afraid to bring things from other fields like the business world into medicine. We can benefit a lot from a lot of different ideas from different places. Listen to people. If you're in leadership, listen to people who are not. Listen to people who are starting their careers. Listen to people. Be receptive to the ideas that they have. And I think the last thing that I want to mention is nothing ever goes to plan. So be flexible. Be adaptable, be flexible, and just because something doesn't go to plan doesn't mean it's going to be all bad. There may be a pleasant surprise in there.
Mm-hmm. And outside of this podcast, for any listener that says, man, I need more of that, how can I connect with Dr. Kawam? Tell the listeners how they can reach out to you and connect with you and maybe learn more from you or mentor with you or just talk to you more.
Absolutely. So you can reach me on LinkedIn, which is essentially my name, Alae Kawam. And you can also contact me via Twitter, which is @KawamA92. And you will see me and my photos up there, and feel free to reach out.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Kawam.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with you.
This was an awesome conversation. I can't wait for our listeners to reach out to you to learn more. Thank you to our listening audience for tuning in to the show today with Dr. Kawam talking about staff burnout, what it is, how to signal it, how to identify it, and how to be an advocate for yourself and your team when it comes to wellness. If you like what you heard today and you want to listen to our previous shows, we have over 100 episodes. So we've got a lot of tools in our toolbox for you. Make sure you subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss another episode. You can follow me on all my social media at Stephanie Whitehead. Tune in next week for another amazing episode of our podcast, the Elaborate Topics Podcast. And until then, have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Elaborate Topics, where your hosts discussed relevant strategies for laboratory professionals. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and listen to us on directimpactbroadcasting.com. Stay tuned for another episode with information you can use to excel in your laboratory career.